Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Well, hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Moggcast. I'm Mark Wallace, the Executive Editor of Conservative Home, and I'm joined this week by a Rees-Mogg, but not our conventional, normal attendee Jacob Rees-Mogg, but Annunziata Rees-Mogg, MEP of the Brexit Party. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for agreeing to come on the Moggcast.
Absolute pleasure.
I'm sure listeners might not have factored in the possibility they might get more Moggcasts, more Rees-Moggs per Moggcast for their money. So it's a nice surprise for all involved. We're interviewing you in deepest Lincolnshire at the moment, obviously deep in the summer, parliamentary recess for both the European Parliament and the Westminster Parliament.
Absolutely.
But politics, of course, has not stopped, particularly for those of you who become MEPs so recently.
It certainly hasn't, that all the issues are still ongoing. And with the looming deadline of the 31st of October, there's a lot to make sure has happened and is secure before then.
And how's it been what's the actual process of becoming an MEP? What's it like? What kind of happens after the applause and presumably champagne kind of fades away on election night? What actually happens to a new British MEP?
One has to go over to Brussels basically to sign an awful lot of paperwork in vast quantities, so that it does take most of a whole day just signing forms and being given other forms and then filling in those forms and making sure that everything is registered, regulated and above board, which I accept is perfectly necessary. And then you don't actually start. So the election was on the 23rd of May, but you don't become officially an MEP until this year it was the 2nd of July. So then it was off to Brussels and Strasbourg for the rest of July to attend the parliamentary sessions, and in Brussels the committees and the general meetings.
It's quite unusual being an MEP elected directly to the European Parliament for the purpose of its abolition, or at least the abolition of your seat. Have the EU institutions dealt okay with the arrival of Brexit Party MEPs, or?
The EU does not acknowledge dissent, and it wants to quash it. So the Brexit Party, despite being the biggest party within the whole of the European Parliament, has no chairs of committees. We have less speaking time than other MEPs because we're not selling our souls to join a group of essentially either lunatics or federalists, who I would also call lunatics, because I think the federal project is so fundamentally flawed and anti-democratic that it can't be seen as a sensible way forward. And because we don't agree with them, they sideline us.
It must have been it was a fascinating experience really from our point of view at Conservative Home in the run-up to that European election, when we were surveying our party members panel. We were asking, well, how do you intend to vote in the European elections, or the EU election rather, and about 6 in 10 party members on that panel said that they intended to vote Brexit Party. Now, that was a number that we kind of sniffed at a bit at the time, but after the election, YouGov found exactly the same thing from their own. So when you're comparing people, what they say they'll do, and then what they say they've done, to get a match-up, it suggests that's pretty accurate. You're a former Conservative yourself. Is your experience that you come across a lot of Tories, even current Tories, who've kind of quietly given you a nudge and kind of said, I voted for you?
Oh, without a doubt. I was actually one of your panellists for many years as a former Conservative. When I was one, I religiously filled in your surveys, and I did ensure that as I left the Conservative Party, I no longer filled in those surveys, so I didn't skew the Conservative home results. But my experience on the streets was that a lot of Conservatives, the majority I met, were no longer voting for them. We had fundraisers with potential donors from all backgrounds, and in rural Lincolnshire, farmers and that kind of person, who would never have considered voting anything but Conservative. And they were all signing up to the Brexit Party. It was really quite extraordinary. And yes, Boris has had a bounce. But we're still polling, 15, 16%? And those are, some of them are Conservatives. A lot of them are also Labour. And certainly the Labour Party supporters and even members that I've met in the East Midlands are furious with what they see as their London-centric leader, who is not representing the millions of them who voted Leave, but seems to be cozying up to the Lib Dems and the Revokers.
And part of UKIP's experience, obviously previous UKIP, not kind of balmy Tommy Robinson-ish UKIP, part of UKIP's experience under Nigel Farage, even in its pomp, was that a lot of its voters tended to split their votes by purpose. Something that rather gives the lie to the idea that Eurosceptics don't know what they're voting for, is that actually they vote differently at different levels of election. Obviously, the Brexit Party scoops up a lot of votes in the European election.
Yep.
Do you foresee the same thing will happen? That actually these are voters who will vote in for the European Parliament in one way, but in a general election in another? Or do you think there's something that's kind of cleaved permanently from...
I think that hugely depends on what Boris Johnson does. And if he does deliver a clean Brexit by the 31st of October, I think an awful lot of voters will return to the Conservative Party. However, they haven't made up their minds to do that yet. I think there are an awful lot of people who are floating between the Brexit Party and the Conservatives, and between the Brexit Party and potentially Labour if they got their act together, waiting to see exactly what's going to happen, but not giving the lifelong support they previously have to the Conservatives, and looking at voting for us if we haven't left. But really importantly is this idea that Leavers didn't know what they were voting for, that you just mentioned. I have never come across such well-informed people as I have done in the last 6 months. That if you talk to people on the streets of Chesterfield, Mansfield, Lincoln, Nottingham, it doesn't make any difference. They know exactly what they voted for, but really importantly, they know exactly what they want now, and they know that it is not Theresa May's deal, treaty, whatever you want to call it. It is not the withdrawal agreement itself, it's not the political declaration, it's not the backstop. That they want a clean break. They don't want any kind of customs union, they don't want any ongoing jurisdiction by the ECJ. And they have really looked at the previous speeches, the indications from the European Union. They have read Theresa May's treaty. They know the detail and they know why it's bad.
And there are two kind of possible general election, or broadly possible general election scenarios that both of which you kind of hinted at there. One is the outcome in which a Brexit of some form has happened, whether it's deemed to be Brexit in name only, or a subpar Brexit, or a transitional Brexit, or indeed a no-deal scenario, a kind of WTO, kind of clean Brexit. And then there's an election afterwards. The other is an election in which either there's an election before Brexit happens to some degree, or the very act of Parliament somehow delaying, or indeed the government, God forbid, delaying Brexit further, causes an election to happen.
Yeah.
So either a no confidence, some form of collapsing of the government, or the government deciding to say, listen, Parliament keeps obstructing us, we need a majority. Effectively the speech that Theresa May gave in 2017, when she did have a majority, they would need to say
skillfully lost.
Indeed, say we don't have one, and we need one. To pick apart those two kind of scenarios, in a situation where we've left the EU after the 31st of October, and it's not a no-deal Brexit, but there's been some form of agreement, where does the line kind of stand for you in terms of what's acceptable or what needs fighting? So if we had, say, a deletion of the backstop completely, but an implementation of the rest of the deal as it currently stood, would that be...
I would carry on fighting it tooth and nail. The withdrawal agreement itself and the political declaration are horrific documents from a British sovereignty point of view. The reason I have been fighting for us to leave the European Union as long as I have is that I believe that sovereignty lies with the people of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, and we elect representatives to do that. If a government, as has happened for successive governments for political generations, hand that power to unelected representatives in Brussels, they're tying the hands of their successors, and I think that's unconstitutional and bad for the democracy of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, and that's what we have to stand against. The withdrawal agreement has so many flaws in it that could tie us perpetually to all sorts of hindrances to actually running our own country, that is not actual leaving. The people I talk to, the supporters, the floating voters, they know this detail. They know that's not a deal that actually gives what they voted for. They voted to leave the institutions of the European Union completely. And so if, on the outside chance, I can't see them being willing to do it without very serious pressure, the European Union offered a free trade deal, then that would be absolutely acceptable. That is what we would like in an ideal world. And that's certainly what the Brexit Party has aimed for. If it is anything further than that, we'll carry on fighting against it, because the British people deserve better.
You anticipated my next question, which is when you say that, when you mentioned earlier independence of governance, but also independence of law, so in terms of the judiciary escaping the ECJ, by implication that means effectively a free trade agreement of some sort. Assuming that we don't have time to secure one in the usual plodding detail that the EU might like, or that these kind of negotiations normally involve by the 31st of October, that means effectively that the acceptable thing would be a clean break, WTO terms, no deal.
Absolutely, and the EU is, I think, considering cutting off its nose to spite its face, that under WTO terms, the net loser is the European Union itself, that because we import more than we export, they are the ones that lose out in terms of trade. They also obviously lose out on our 39 billion, the figure changes every now and then, but in that ballpark, growing all the time. They also lose out on our potential liabilities of up to, I think it's 200 billion for bailouts. And they really should, if they were acting logically, give us a good trade deal so that all of it can continue very smoothly. They don't seem to be considering it because I think they are worried it will be a contagion and give other countries within the European Union the confidence to go it alone if Britain comes out of it in a very good position. But I think we still can on WTO terms, because we can do trade deals with the rest of the world. We've seen America, Australia, lots of countries are actually coming to us wanting to trade, and we can do that, which will more than offset the WTO tariffs with the EU.
And to continue our kind of thought experiment, obviously one possible reason why the EU might be holding out is that there are people in Parliament who are telling Brussels, hold out and Parliament will prevent this. And so that puts us to a certain extent, potentially we achieve the kind of have a no deal Brexit outcome or a free trade agreement outcome. Alternatively, we have a situation where come September, either Jeremy Corbyn's apparently ongoing negotiations with various Conservative backbenchers, as we've learned, so we're recording this on Friday, for listeners who might be hearing it on a later date, potentially those negotiations, potentially John Bercow producing some new constitutional innovation, should we say, in some format, Parliament acts to, or Parliament, or indeed the courts, act to try and prevent a Brexit on those terms by that date, the two essential kind of criteria. In that situation, that effectively pre-Brexit general election comes about, either forced on Boris Johnson under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, or called by Boris Johnson, potentially preempting what he thinks will be inevitable. You may as well do something yourself if you're going to be forced to do it anyway. In that situation, the Brexit Party has a bit of a poser, does it not? And you kind of have a slight difficulty that if you have a situation in which Greens, Lib Dems, and various other Remainy parties choose to strategically put up one candidate in different seats to try and unify their Remain vote, the continuity Remain vote. And the Brexit Party and the Conservative Party compete fully. I think you've announced, is it 150 or 300 candidates now?
I think we're on 225, aren't we, at the moment?
225, almost smack between my estimates. And in that circumstance, isn't there a danger that we end up effectively with a split Leave vote against a unified Remain vote?
But only if the Conservatives are Leavers. And if you look at candidates that are currently still Conservative candidates, such as Philip Hammond, I think it's very difficult to argue that they are a Leave candidate or indeed a Leave party. And if democracy is to work at all, the electorate have to have choices. They have to have different political views which they can support or not support. And I think it's actually our duty to make sure that we do have candidates representing the Leave voters who, after all, did win the referendum. They are the largest number of voters in the country. And to leave them abandoned with Remainiac Conservatives, just because they're Conservatives, would be a derogation of our duty. And it doesn't stop there, that the whole of the Conservative Party needs to be reminded that Leave won. And I think an awful lot of Conservative MPs have forgotten that. There are many that pay lip service, and you see great comments from former Remainers, as they call themselves, saying of course now they're Leave, which they've demonstrated by voting for Theresa May's deal 3 times, and that wasn't a Leavers treaty. It's not proof you're a Leaver that you voted for it, it's proof you're a Leaver if you didn't, because it traps us in. And I think it's so unclear. Fine, Boris Johnson is making all the right noises about being a true Leaver who believes in freeing our country from the shackles of the European Union, as the British people called for in 2016. His party still isn't. His cabinet is still majority Remain. I think it's absolutely necessary that they have a constant reminder, and if we haven't left, we will have to fight them so that people can have a say.
Is that a universal fight in them, or is that by implication something where there might be... Is there space for some people to face?
I personally would not agree to go head-to-head with Jacob. That I know my brother absolutely believes in returning the sovereignty of the United Kingdom to our own government and to get us to leave the European Union fully. I think he and others were in a very difficult position the 3rd time the withdrawal bill came through, and in my view took the wrong decision, but they took what they saw as the only course of action available to them, because at that point, with Theresa May as leader, it looked like it was vote for her deal or revoke, and revoke would be worse. So it was the lesser of 2 pretty evils to vote for the withdrawal agreement. I wouldn't have done, because I think standing up for your principles is too fundamental to always do the pragmatic thing. However, for those in Parliament who have just given lip service to pretending to switch sides, they have got to be fought.
So does there come an ultimatum from the Brexit Party, effectively a kind of list of Conservative MPs where you say, listen, were you to choose to reselect these MPs as your candidates again, Philip Hammond was one example you mentioned, obviously it's your choice whether you select them again, but if you choose them, we'll stand against them? Or is it something where it's kind of suck it and see, you wait until nominations day and you find out?
If you look at the list of candidates we've selected, they are already, the prospective parliamentary candidates, are already being put up against Leavers and Remainers. That, for example, Telford, we've already selected a prospective candidate, and of course she was a big Leaver the whole way through. It's not any doubt about that. It is to give the electorate choice and to hold the whole of the Conservative Party to account. and to make sure it follows through on its latest pledges. We had 3 years of Theresa May saying that we would leave on the 29th of March, that no deal was better than a bad deal. None of it was true.
Will you be standing
No.
as a parliamentary candidate?
No, I've absolutely ruled it out.
Like the MEP is as far as it goes. And then...
It is that I was so incensed when we didn't leave on the 29th and so worried about where our democracy was heading, that I had friends within the Conservative Party who were cutting up their membership cards. I knew of Labour Party members who were tearing up their local election ballot papers. I saw graffiti that said, "Don't vote, act." And I thought we were getting to a very dangerous place for the future of our democracy. And that did drag me back into politics, just not being able to sit by and watch it happen. I think we're actually in a much better place now, that our democracy is looking much healthier. I think the Brexit Party has given a boost to that and represented people who had felt so ignored, so voiceless, so unrepresented, that things were getting worrying. And I think that it has calmed down now that they do have a voice, and we're shouting as loudly as we can, despite the European Union trying to sideline us and silence us as much as possible.
You mentioned the way you characterise it before was sometimes you have to do the principled thing, not the pragmatic thing. And you also just mentioned you've been dragged back into politics, effectively. So for listeners who might not know the full history, in 2010 you were, like your brother, a Conservative parliamentary candidate in Somerton. And I think I'm right in saying that the UKIP candidate in that seat picked up marginally more votes than the margin by which the Lib Dem MP scraped home and hung on to the seat. Mm-hmm. That must be, it's kind of difficult for you in a sense as a memory in that, because it's quite obviously an unpleasant experience to go through.
I do disagree with that a lot of people, and particularly my supporters from the Conservative Party within Somerton and Frome, really did blame UKIP for that. I don't. And I never did. That no party can or should take its support for granted. People aren't born Conservative and die Conservative. People aren't born Labour and die Labour. They vote for what they think is the best outcome at that time. And if you can't demonstrate that, you don't deserve to win. But also I looked at the figures for Somerton and Frome, and the postal votes landed on people's doorsteps the morning after the debate of the party leaders, where everyone agreed with Nick. And it was quite well known that "I agree with Nick" was a slogan after that debate. And the following morning, our postal votes went out, and the Lib Dems won about 80% of those postal votes. That's not UKIP's fault. That was potentially David Cameron's fault. It was potentially the huge attraction at that time, it seems to have waned rather since, of Nick Clegg. But it was certainly not UKIP's fault. And UKIP voters are not, and were never, synonymous with Conservative voters. A lot of them would otherwise not have voted. Some of them would have voted Labour. Some of them would have voted Green. They're people from all sorts of different political persuasions who coalesced over one issue. And the Brexit Party in that way is similar. We're extremely different to UKIP, a party I would never have considered joining or voting for. But we do draw our support from a multitude of other parties. And I've certainly come across ex-Liberal Democrats. I had Channel 4 follow me around Mansfield, and they asked a lady how she'd voted in the local elections, and being Channel 4, they were delighted to discover she'd voted Liberal Democrat. And then she said, "That's because they're my neighbours and they take my bins out for me. They're very nice people. I'll be voting Brexit Party at the European elections and until we actually leave the European Union." And so our voters are coming from all different parties, and different elections do attract different levels of support. That's clearly true. But it's not just hammering home to the Conservatives that we're taking their voters, it's reminding Labour that they've gone back on their manifesto as well.
There's a danger there for both the main parties that you pick out, essentially, and particularly in acting and talking as though voters belong to them, as if they have a kind of proprietary right to people's votes.
I think that's great arrogance.
There's also a danger, I suppose I'm driving at, to Brexit to a certain extent as levers, in that victory in 2016 came, albeit with some divisions within the kind of Brexiteer camp.
Yeah.
It came ultimately by a lot of people deciding to put aside their differences and managing to get over the line enough for a majority to get what we wanted. Is there a danger, in your view, that whether it's even if it's the Conservative Party's fault that there's a pre-Brexit election and it fails to fulfil its promise to carry out a proper Brexit by the 31st of October, is there a danger to Brexit that we end up with a pre-Brexit general election which revoke supporting Liberal Democrat MPs, for example, get back in on margins smaller than the Brexit Party vote compared to the Conservatives, or indeed vice versa, as you saw in St. Petersburg?
I mean, I think it's still assuming that votes just transfer from the Conservatives to the Brexit Party, and I don't think that's true. And so if you look at the result in Wales at the by-election last month, of course it was close, and the margin the Brexit Party took was slightly greater than the amount that the Conservatives lost to the Liberal Democrats at the alliance, the Remain alliance, by. But look at Labour's vote. It absolutely collapsed. And a lot of those voters would have come to the Brexit Party. You can't say that just mathematically the Conservatives would have won because the Brexit Party took their votes. We took a lot from Labour as well. And so the Lib Dems would potentially still have won if we hadn't taken the votes just from the Conservatives. And the important thing is that people have a voice. And what was damaging our democracy was that people didn't have any outlet for their views, their vision of how the country should be run. And now they do. I think that's a much healthier place, regardless of results. I believe in the British people, and I trust our voters absolutely to do the right thing, to give the right results. And I think it's very clear that election after election they have. That I was a Conservative Party member under John Major. Well, I was actually one under Maggie Thatcher too. But John Major was a disaster in the mid to late 90s. He did not deserve to win the 97 election. So Blair did. And despite the fact I was a Conservative, I knew the British people had at that point done the only sensible thing they could do. If you look at Theresa May going into the 2017 election, with the arrogance that was quite extraordinary of she was going to walk it, she didn't deserve to win that with that attitude, for taking the British people for granted. And indeed, she lost.
Now, we've only got a couple more minutes left in the podcast. And so I wanted to ask a little bit, can you give our listeners a little bit of an insight into the kind of formation and the stage of development of a new party? Because in a sense, the Brexit Party is a bit unusual in that it's not a membership structure in the same way. Yep. You become a supporter, I think, of the Brexit Party. And I think it's probably fair to say that by accident or design, Nigel has managed to escape a little bit of some of the UKIP NEC troubles that he experienced in the past. But
yeah.
What's it like in terms of, in your patch, are there troops out campaigning? Are there structures developing? Or are they already in place? Or what kind of machine is there in advance of these elections?
It is absolutely phenomenal that no party in the history of our country has gone from 0 to 60 anywhere near as quickly. And having launched, I think it was the 11th of April, we topped the poll on the 23rd of May. We have county organisers, we have constituency organisers, there is a full structure in place. We have teams out every single weekend and once a month, big weekends, where there are hundreds of teams out across the country. And the extraordinary level of passionate support is something I'm afraid I never came across in the Conservative Party. That our supporters want to run street stalls on a rainy Saturday in August. And it makes no difference, rain or shine. They put their rain hats on or their sunglasses on and crack on with getting the message out. They are amazing people who just so strongly believe in the future freedoms of our country that they have to get the message out. And it is a wonderful, uplifting experience working with them.
And one final question that I'm sure some of our listeners will be hoping for me to ask, which is, what would it take? What could the Conservative Party do to persuade you to rejoin it and one day have a Moggcast in which you and your brother are sat side by side, both as Conservatives?
I've got no desire to remain in politics, and I've got no intention of going back to the Conservatives with a begging bowl. But if we leave the European Union absolutely cleanly and we are able to go out and make free trade deals with the rest of the world, to set our own laws, to dictate our own taxes, our own subsidies, then I will feel my job is done and I can retire from the world of politics.
Back to beautiful Lincolnshire.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Annunziata Rees-Mogg, for your time and your insights. It's been really fascinating, and I'm sure our listeners will be really interested to hear from another member of the Rees-Mogg family. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.